Shalom. This is Avraham Shira from Nar Shalom with our little Erev Shabbat talk from the Baal Shem Tov. Today we're going to continue learning about the distinctions of pleasure between Shabbat and the weekday, between the physical and spiritual pleasure. And as is the way of the Baal Shem Tov, he puts many of his teachings in stories. Most of these teachings were gathered by Rabbi Yaakov Yosef of Polonoi, who was one of the main students of the Baal Shem Tov. He was considered a massive Talmid Chacham and a tremendous scholar and servant of Hashem before he met the Baal Shem Tov. And then when he became a follower of the Master, he found his place as the one who would gather the stories and teachings of the Rav. And so in that position, he was not considered the rabbi anymore, but he was the follower of the tzaddik. And we see that there's a tremendous amount of humility involved with that. But Rabbi Yaakov Yosef was remembered forever as the student of the Baal Shem Tov who wrote down all of these wonderful teachings for us. Okay, so we are going to tell the story of a king. And the king had a son, his only son, who was taken away in captive to a foreign city. It was a very difficult captivity. ועברו זמנים תולדות נמשכה מלודות לבתולדות and a great amount of time and heartache passed while he was far away from his father, the king. And after many years and much homesickness, as you can imagine, a letter came to the son of the king. And the king wrote in the letter not to despair. He was doing everything he could to try to find him and save him. And he told him not to forget the protocols of the palace, the manners of the aristocracy, the kavod, the honor of the way one conducts oneself as the son of the king. Especially when he's living amongst what the Rav here calls Ben Ze'eve Erev, the wolves of the night. So, ki od ayado netuya lachziro lebeto el beit aviv al yidei kam mitztakot milchamot over shalom, because the king said, I'm still making the efforts and I'm going to get you home. And whether it's war or whether it's strategies or spies, I'm going to get you home. And the son of the king, the prince, was very joyous. He was so joyous, in fact, that he wanted to tell all his friends, the people he had got to know, the Ze'eve Erev, the wolves of the evening, about his joy that he'd received a letter from the king. But he knew he could not tell them. He could not reveal his true identity. Because if he did, they would immediately seize upon him as an opportunity to blackmail and further his suffering and sorrow. And yet he had this tremendous joy inside, but he wasn't able to express it outside. And so what did the king's son do? Well, he took his friends from the city that he was captive in, and they went out to a pub, and they drank wine, and the Rav even writes, and other things that make a person drunk. And they had a great party. And all the guys that came to the party had a were very happy with their physical pleasures, etc., drinking, laughing, telling jokes, stories, etc. But the king's son, all the while that everybody was partying, he was getting this inner joy from the letter he received from his father, the king. And this story really operates on many levels at once, which all the stories of the great tzaddikim managed to do. But on the surface level, we understand that the king's son could not show his joy in a dark place, in a place of people who did not have the values of the king. But how does this teach us about the pleasure of Shabbat? And perhaps it teaches us more. Well, we know that the pleasure of Shabbat is not eating and drinking per se. There is pleasure of eating and drinking on Shabbat. But it's not the highest sort of pleasure. The highest pleasure of Shabbat is the Shabbat itself. The idea of Shabbat. The rest. The attachment to God that comes down upon us, whether we do all the Kabbalistic meditations and prayers or not. Now, those prayers and meditations are obviously going to help us. But Shabbat, when Shabbat comes, the atmosphere changes. The physical atmosphere changes. The spiritual atmosphere changes. The world seems to take a break for 24 hours. And in that break, there's inner rest, inner peace, inner comfort. But that's a kind of comfort it's very hard to describe to others, certainly to share. You can put it into words, just like we're attempting here. But is that inner comfort the real thing? No, we're just estimating it in words. The true pleasure of Shabbat is unique to each and every person who keeps Shabbat. But the real point of the Shabbat is to give us time to open up the holy books, to sit with our friends and our families and read the great stories and ideas of the sages, and to engage our minds in activities that are not really locked into this world. You know, if you go to Kiddush on Shabbos morning, a lot of times, guys will start telling stories. And next thing you know, the conversation descends into politics and descends into other areas that are not in holiness. And you feel the atmosphere shift. It kind of sinks. And then finally somebody says, wait, it's Shabbat. Tell me a Divrei Torah. That sinking feeling is because the conversation has a spiritual component to it that goes up and down with where we are. Okay, very nice. So we understand that the Shabbat pleasure is an inner pleasure that we derive from the Torah, from the day, from the holiness of in time and place. Certainly in Jerusalem, you feel a Shabbat, a very powerful thing. Certainly in Tzfat and other holy places, it's even easier to feel, to sense. In nature, we can have that even if you live in, Mexico City. If you can just get a few moments away in nature, you'll more easily access that inner joy of Shabbat. That's why over and over Rabbi Nachman impresses us with the idea of the importance of talking alone with Hashem in nature. Getting away from the community, away from the bustle of the city, especially when you're living outside the Holy Land. Because the Holy Land itself radiates something special. also during the weekdays. Okay, but let's take it to another level. What if the prince is all the Jewish people? And the king, of course, is still Hashem. And the prince taken into captivity is the 2,000-year exile. And the king is sending letters to the Jews in exile. Don't worry, I'm not giving up on you. I'm going to save you. I'm going to bring you home. I'm not going to leave you stuck in captivity amongst the wolves of the evening. Those hungry wolves, they like a little sheep, you know? And now the mashal becomes much more profound because it's speaking in a prophetic fashion about the entire Jewish people at the end of exile. I'm going to get you out. I'm going to do everything I can to get you out. I'm going to knock out the radical Muslims, and I'm going to knock out the radical people of other races and religions, and I'm going to give you back the land, and I'm going to get you back home to my palace, Eretz Israel. And don't despair, and carry the hope and the joy inside. Well, be careful where you tell and who you tell, what you tell about this letter. There are places where you have to hide your joy because other people might be jealous and other people might be vindictive, and all kinds of unpleasant emotions seem to be aroused by non-Jews when they see that Jews are happy. Especially when we're happy in the mitzvot of the king. And think about it, if you were a non-Jew and you didn't have Shabbat, how would you feel when you see all these people taking a day off and having a great time? And celebrating the creation, and celebrating the Creator, and celebrating their families. You know, I think some of us, we've been there. It's important to remember those times, those years when we didn't have Shabbat. Not only does it give us more appreciation for what we have today in Shabbat, but it also gives us compassion on the people who don't have Shabbat, and to pray for them, and to understand what it must be like, because we've been there. And the king is calling us back to the palace. And the doors are open. And the airports are waiting. Now, how long that will be, I don't know. You know, with one phone call, Obama closed the airports of the world. One rocket towards Ben Gurion. He picks up the phone, tells the FAA, we can't fly into Ben Gurion. Well, what happens? All the other airlines fall like dominoes. Suddenly nobody's flying into Ben Gurion. That should open our eyes a little bit, folks. How easy the leaders of the world can manipulate the masses. How easily they can make a new tax where you can't get your money out of the bank or out of the country. How easily you can be labeled and misrepresented and demonized because you believe in one God, the Jewish God, who is the only God. We can't forget history. And Shabbat is here to help us, to remind us from a good place, from the place of joy, we can think back and understand. From joy, our mind works better, and we can see the patterns of history more clearly. I mentioned this to some friends, and they said, well, what do I do, Avraham? You know, they live in LA, they live in New York. I said, well, the first thing you do is type your travel agent's phone number into your memory, you know, on your phone, and be ready to push that button. get that ticket. Be ready. You know, the Chafetz Chaim had a suitcase always packed. He wandered all over Europe. He came to Eretz Yisrael as well. But these tzaddikim, they always had a bag packed, ready to go. And they didn't have airplanes. You know, they had trains by then, but I don't think it might have been quite a journey to take a train from Warsaw to Jerusalem. I'm not sure how that worked. But the idea, I think, is clear. That the king is calling us home. And we are the princes. Whether we know it or not. Whether we've forgotten our manners or not. Whether we forgot how one lives with the king. Because we spent too many times with the wolves of the evening. And if a person's a wolf of the evening, well, maybe it's time to change costumes. You know? Leave Little Red Riding Hood alone. Stop being a wolf. Lie down with the lamb. Now, of course, that metaphor is about the nations and the Jewish people. The wolf will lie down with the lamb. Zev Garim Kevis. It means all the hungry nations that want that Jewish money and that Jewish blood, they suddenly let it go. They suddenly realize the self-destructive stupidity of hating Jews. And that's part of the messianic vision of the Torah. And we have to hold on to that. Because we have a lot of wonderful non-Jews out there that they're not wolves. They're not trying to eat up the lambs. But there's a few in certain places around the globe that I guess they didn't get the message yet. But they will. Now, even on a deeper level, this Torah can take us. That the prince is your soul. In exile from your upper soul, your king, your divine spark. And the city of our captivity is the body itself. So our conscious soul, the one we live in day to day, the one we think in day to day, the one we follow around the planet doing what we have to do, has an upper component, a divine spark that knows everything, that knows the truth in every situation, that has access to the wisdom of the ancients intuitively. You know, when I first started learning these holy books 30 years ago, I was amazed how much I already knew, that I didn't know that I knew. Because it's there. It's inside you. But it's in captivity, in the body. And the divine spark is calling us from our bodies, inside. Calling us back to health. Calling us back to balance. Calling us back to inner peace. Calling us back to the center, to the heart. The knowing heart, as one of the Ramchal's books is called. The knowing heart means the union between the mind and the heart. This is the real superhighway, folks, between the brain and the heart. As the Sefer Yetzirah teaches, know with Bina and understand with wisdom. That the mind and the heart are informing each other. And that is the geula of the lower soul, of the prince, bringing the prince back to his divine spark. And when each person experiences that, that is his personal Messiah. The Ay, ay, ay. I think that phrase has been used somewhere else. But the idea holds. And when each person gets that light of the inner king, the inner divine spark, then it becomes like a massive spiritual wave that covers the sea and covers the world with the knowledge of God. So you see how much the Baal Shem Tov gives us in one paragraph? That's why we say these people had Ruach HaKodesh. I mean, it's 5 or 6 lines. And when we want to know, we are led to know. So let the Shabbat be a time of knowing, a time of opening that highway between the heart and the mind, of feeling the call of our divine spark. And if you don't feel it, then it's time to understand you are the prince locked outside the palace. You're at the gates, you're at the door, and the door is locked, and it's midnight, and the guards are saying, who are you? I'm the son of the king. And they're saying, well, yeah, everybody's the son of the king. We got a hospital for you. And you can't take no for an answer. You got to keep pounding on the door of the palace until the king is woken in the darkness of the night, and he wakes up. And he says, who's making all that noise? And the guards say, well, some guy says he's your son. Really? Really? My son? He's back? Then the king wakes up. The king is overjoyed. So whether you're inside the palace or outside the palace, there are many walls and there are many doors to get into your Father, into that private, intimate chamber where you are one with your Father, the King. And Shabbat is that time for that experience. So may you all be blessed with a holy Shabbat, a peaceful Shabbat, a contemplative Shabbat. And never put down a Baal Shem Tov story until you've read it a few times and thought about it on a few levels, because they're all operating together. And such is the nature of holiness. And such is the nature of the presence of Hashem. Shabbat Shalom.